Imagine a man captured, tortured, and humiliated before thousands, his very existence turned into a warning. This is the brutal truth of William Wallace's execution, worse than you ever imagined. Subscribe and follow the story as it unfolds. Before sunrise on August 23, 1305, London Bridge stood silent under a cold morning mist, its wooden spikes already crowded with severed heads left to rot as warnings. These were not decorations, they were messages. Every traveler who crossed that bridge was meant to look up and remember what happened to enemies of the English crown. But on this morning, even those dead faces were about to witness something worse than their own fate. Below them, the city prepared for an execution unlike any it had ever seen. This was not a quick death, and it was not justice. It was something carefully planned, something meant to be remembered forever. The man at the center of it all was William Wallace, Scotland's most feared rebel and most famous fighter. What was about to happen to him was not designed simply to end his life. It was meant to destroy his name, his memory, and his meaning. This was not the heroic story told in movies. There would be no mercy, no dignity, and no escape. Every step of what followed was meant to hurt, to shame, and to scare anyone who ever thought of standing up to the king. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why even people used to public executions struggled to process what they saw that day. Here's what most people don't realize about executions in the medieval world. They were never just about punishment. They were carefully staged events, designed to control how people thought and felt. Kings understood that fear could be more powerful than armies, and public violence was one of their strongest tools. When someone was executed in front of a crowd, the real target wasn't the person dying, it was everyone watching. The screams, the suffering, and the long delay before death were meant to sink deep into the mind and stay there. King Edward I understood this better than most. He didn't want William Wallace remembered as a brave fighter or a man who challenged authority. He wanted him remembered as a warning. Every detail of Wallace's death was planned to send one clear message. Resistance would not just fail, it would be erased. This execution was designed like a performance, with a beginning, a slow build, and a horrifying end. It was meant to break the spirit of Scotland by showing exactly what happened to those who refused to submit. Edward believed that if people saw Wallace completely destroyed, body and reputation alike, no one would dare follow his path again. What he didn't understand was that fear doesn't always work the way rulers expect. Before William Wallace became a symbol, he was just a man. He wasn't born a king or a noble with great power behind him. He came from a common family with no throne waiting for him and no destiny written in stone. In fact, nothing about his early life suggested he would one day challenge the most powerful ruler in Britain. Wallace lived in a world where people like him were expected to obey, not lead. But everything changed when English forces tightened their grip on Scotland. What began as personal anger and local resistance slowly grew into something much larger. Wallace proved himself not through titles, but through action. He fought with intelligence, courage, and an understanding of the land that gave him an edge against larger armies. Over time, stories spread. Victories turned into legends. The name William Wallace became something more than a person. It became hope. That transformation is what made his fall so shocking. The man being dragged toward execution was the same man who had once united divided clans and stood against overwhelming odds. And yet none of this was supposed to happen. Wallace was never meant to become a national figure. He wasn't chosen by fate. He stepped into that role because circumstances forced him there, and because he refused to back down when it mattered most. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, was not a reckless tyrant. He was a calculated ruler who planned every move carefully. To him, William Wallace was more than a rebel. He was an insult. Wallace's continued freedom made Edward look weak, and that was something the king could not tolerate. Edward placed a massive reward on Wallace's head, 30 pounds sterling, an amount so large it could change a person's life overnight. That bounty turned ordinary people into informants and neighbors into threats. Edward's spy network spread across Scotland, reaching into taverns, churches, and homes. Many Scottish nobles chose safety over resistance. They bent the knee, believing survival was wiser than defiance. Wallace refused. He would not swear loyalty, and every day he remained free was a reminder that Edward's control was incomplete. That defiance made Wallace dangerous, not just militarily, but symbolically. As long as Wallace lived, resistance had a face. Edward's obsession grew stronger with every passing year. He didn't just want Wallace dead. He wanted him captured, displayed, and destroyed in a way that would make rebellion seem pointless. To Edward, Wallace wasn't a man anymore. He was a problem that needed a permanent solution. In the end, William Wallace wasn't defeated on the battlefield. He was betrayed. Years of pressure, fear, and rewards had made trust dangerous, and eventually someone close to him broke. A Scottish knight named Sir John Menteith, who had recently pledged loyalty to Edward, played a key role in Wallace's capture. Near Glasgow, Wallace walked into an ambush he never saw coming. The most painful part wasn't the weapons drawn against him. It was recognizing familiar faces among those arresting him. These were people from his own land, men who spoke his language and knew his cause. Wallace was taken alive, and that detail mattered deeply. Dying in combat would have made him a hero's memory. Capture meant something far worse. The English wanted him breathing, suffering, and visible. As he was bound and led away, Wallace must have known what awaited him. English law had no mercy for those labeled traitors. This moment marked the true end of Wallace the warrior and the beginning of Wallace the symbol. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade because it showed how fear had spread through Scotland. The resistance was cracking, and Edward believed victory was finally complete. He was wrong, but at that moment Wallace stood alone, surrounded by enemies, with no escape left. Wallace's journey from Scotland to London was not treated like the transport of a prisoner. It was a moving display of humiliation. He was paraded through towns and villages so people could stare at the man they had been taught to fear. Some watched in silence. Others shouted insults or threw whatever they could find. Wallace was no longer addressed as a knight or leader. He was treated like an animal being delivered for slaughter. Locked in restraints, unable to respond, he became an object for curiosity and anger. Worse than the physical discomfort was the waiting. Wallace knew English law well enough to understand what punishment awaited him. Each mile south gave him more time to imagine it. The journey itself became a form of torture, built on fear and anticipation. The English wanted the story of his capture to spread faster than he traveled. By the time Wallace reached London, the city was ready. People weren't coming to see a man. They were coming to see a symbol fall. This slow transformation from leader to spectacle was intentional. The English were stripping Wallace of his identity piece by piece. By the time he arrived at his destination, they wanted no one to see a hero, only a warning. London in late summer was crowded, loud, and unclean. Narrow streets trapped heat and smells, and word of Wallace's arrival spread quickly. People poured into the streets, not out of curiosity alone, but because they had been taught to hate him. For years, English propaganda had painted Wallace as a monster, a destroyer, someone responsible for endless suffering. By the time he entered the city, many believed they were about to witness justice. Wallace spent his final night confined and guarded, knowing there would be no rescue and no mercy. According to records, he prayed quietly, not for escape, but for strength. Morning would bring the end, and everyone knew it. Outside, the city prepared like it was hosting a grim festival. Crowds gathered early, eager to claim good viewing spots. This wasn't hidden punishment. It was public, loud, and unavoidable. London had decided to watch. The air was heavy with expectation. Wallace, once a man of action, now had nothing to do but wait. The silence of that final night may have been the last peace he would ever know. Everything after that would be designed to strip away dignity, identity, and finally life itself. Westminster Hall was grand, massive, and meant to impress. That day it was filled with spectators who had come not for justice, but for theater. The trial of William Wallace was never meant to be fair. The judges were chosen by the king, and the verdict was decided before Wallace ever spoke. Charges were read aloud: treason, murder, destruction, crimes against the crown. The list was long and overwhelming, but there was a problem. Under English law, treason required loyalty, and Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward. Wallace pointed this out calmly and clearly. He stated that Edward was not his king and never had been. It was a moment of pure defiance, spoken without shouting, without fear. That truth didn't matter. The court ignored it. The trial continued as if his words had never been spoken. Wallace was not there to be judged. He was there to be condemned. The legal process was just another part of the performance meant to give violence the appearance of law. When the sentencing came, there was no surprise. The hall was silent, not because people felt pity, but because they understood something terrible was coming next.
The sentence given to William Wallace was long, detailed, and deliberate. Each part had a purpose, and none of it was designed for mercy. He would be dragged through the streets, then hanged, then further punished even after death. This wasn't simply a list of actions, it was a plan to erase a man completely. The dragging was meant to weaken and shame him. The hanging was meant to bring him close to death without release. What followed was designed to destroy any remaining dignity and ensure there would be no proper burial, no grave, and no place for people to mourn. This punishment was meant to send pieces of Wallace's body across the land as warnings. Edward wanted Scotland to see that even in death, Wallace would not be whole. The sentence wasn't rushed. It was read slowly so everyone could understand exactly what was about to happen. This was terror written into law. The words alone were enough to make experienced soldiers uneasy. And yet, as horrifying as the sentence sounded, the reality would be far worse. Words could not fully describe what the executioners were about to carry out. The true horror was still ahead. Once the sentence was passed, events moved quickly. Wallace was stripped of his remaining dignity and bound to a wooden frame designed to be pulled through the streets. As he was dragged forward, the city became part of the punishment. Crowds followed, some shouting, others simply staring. Stones and refuse flew from the sides. The streets were rough, and every movement caused pain. Wallace remained alive and aware, forced to endure every second. This was not accidental cruelty. It was intentional suffering, meant to exhaust and break him before the final stage. The slow pace ensured the crowd had time to watch. Blood marked the path behind him, a visible reminder of what defiance cost. Wallace could not shield himself or turn away. The journey was long, winding through busy parts of the city so as many people as possible would see him reduced to something barely recognizable. By the time the procession reached its destination, the man who had once led armies was barely recognizable. This was the point of no return. From here on, there would be no stopping, no mercy, and no turning back. Smithfield was a place long used for executions, and the crowd knew what to expect. But even for them, this was different. Wallace was brought forward and prepared with care, not kindness. The executioners were professionals, trained to control pain and timing. The hanging that followed was not meant to be quick. It was meant to frighten, to show suffering without allowing release. The crowd watched closely as Wallace struggled, then was brought back again. This careful balance between life and death shocked even those who had seen executions before. Murmurs spread as excitement turned into unease. People began to realize this was not entertainment. It was something darker. The executioners worked without emotion, following a plan they knew well. Wallace's strength was fading, but his awareness had not fully left him. The silence that fell over the crowd spoke louder than cheers ever could. This was the moment many realized they were witnessing something they would never forget. Fear had replaced celebration, and the lesson Edward wanted to teach was being burned into every mind present. What followed pushed the limits of what people could understand or endure. This stage of the execution was meant to be final proof of absolute power. Wallace, still alive, was forced to witness his own destruction. The crowd, once loud, grew quiet. Some turned away, others froze, unable to move. The executioners continued with methodical precision, ensuring the punishment lasted as long as possible without ending life too quickly. the air filled with unbearable sights and smells that no one present would ever forget. Wallace's cries faded as his strength failed, but the process did not stop. This was the heart of the punishment, the moment Edward believed would erase Wallace from memory by turning him into something pitiful and broken. Instead, it created shock and horror that even hardened spectators struggled to accept. This was the moment when fear crossed into something else, something closer to disbelief. The idea that a human being could be treated this way in the name of law shook many who watched. This was the point where the execution became worse than anyone had imagined. When Wallace finally died, there was no peace. Death did not bring dignity. His body was treated as an object, divided according to the sentence. Each movement was done with purpose, not anger. The executioners worked as if following instructions in a manual. Wallace's head was lifted for the crowd to see, the final confirmation that the man was gone. But the punishment was not finished. His body was separated into parts, prepared for transport to different locations. These pieces were meant to serve as warnings across the land. Even in death, Wallace was not allowed to rest. The ritual nature of the process made it worse. This wasn't chaos. It was organized, calm, and deliberate. The crowd slowly began to leave, some in silence, others speaking quietly as if unsure what to say. The spectacle was over, but its effect was only beginning. The body of William Wallace had been destroyed, but the memory of what was done to him had burned itself into everyone who watched. Edward believed the execution would end resistance. Instead, it did the opposite. The parts of Wallace's body sent to different towns did not create fear. They created anger and sorrow. People visited these sites in secret, leaving small signs of respect despite the danger. Songs began to spread, quiet at first, then louder. Wallace became more powerful in death than he had ever been alive. Even those who had once opposed him began to question their loyalty. One man deeply affected was Robert the Bruce, who would later lead Scotland to victory. Wallace's death forced people to choose sides again. English officials noticed the change too late. The execution that was meant to crush hope had created a martyr. Fear had failed. Meaning had taken its place. Edward had destroyed a body, but he had created a symbol that could not be controlled. Wallace's execution became a model for future rulers who believed terror could control people. But history showed the flaw in that thinking. Brutality can silence voices for a time, but it also creates stories that last far longer. Wallace's final words about loyalty and freedom were remembered, repeated, and passed down. Edward died still trying to control Scotland, never fully succeeding. Wallace, on the other hand, lived on as an idea. His suffering became a reminder that authority without consent is fragile. Over time, his story inspired not just Scots, but others who faced powerful rulers. The execution meant to erase him had given him immortality. Terror had backfired, turning a rebel into a lasting symbol of resistance. William Wallace lost everything that day. His body, his freedom, and his life were taken in the most brutal way imaginable. But one thing could not be taken from him: meaning. The execution meant to erase him ensured he would never be forgotten. His suffering showed that power enforced only through fear eventually fails. True authority requires consent, not cruelty. Wallace's death reminds us that martyrdom can become a kind of victory, even when everything else is lost. 700 years later, the echo of that morning still lingers, asking the same question it asked then. What is a life worth, and what is worth suffering for?